You know how a pregnancy works. Egg meets sperm, cell divides. 9 months pass, baby arrives. Simple, linear. Time moves in one direction. Except here is a case where that timeline breaks. In July 2025, a healthy baby girl was born in the United States. Her parents were in their mid-20s. They'd been married a few years. They went through a legal adoption process, standard. But the embryo that became their daughter was frozen in 1994, 30 years earlier, when her mother was a toddler. This child is, by one definition, 30 years old. She was biologically set in motion before her parents knew how to read, before the internet existed in its current form, before most of you had your first email address. She holds the verified record for the longest frozen embryo ever to result in a live birth.
She was born on October 26th and broke the record set by her older sister. Now, Emma Wren Gibson arrived in 2017 after spending 24 years as a frozen embryo. We met Emma and talked to her parents 3 years ago.
And the science that made it possible reveals something genuinely strange about the nature of time, biology, and what it means to be alive. But first, you need to understand why freezing a living cell should be impossible, and why, for most of human history, it was. Here is something most people get wrong about freezing. The problem isn't the cold, it's the water. Every living cell is mostly water. When water freezes, it expands by about 9%. It forms jagged crystal structures. Those crystals act like glass shards inside the cell, shredding the membrane from the inside out. Freeze a strawberry, defrost it, you get mush. The same physics applied to human embryos, and for decades it made the entire idea seem hopeless. The fix didn't come from brute force, it came from chemistry. Scientists developed a class of compounds called cryoprotectants. This is basically the anti-freeze for your cells. You load them into the embryo before freezing. They displace the water. No water, no crystals. No crystals, no damage. The technique is called vitrification, from the Latin for glass. At negative 196 degrees Celsius, the embryo enters a state where all molecular motion essentially stops. It doesn't slow down. It doesn't tick forward at a different rate. It stops completely. This is the part that rewired my understanding of the whole story. Because the question everyone asks is, can an embryo survive 30 years of freezing? That's the wrong question. The right question is, can the infrastructure around the embryo survive 30 years? The tank, the liquid nitrogen levels, the power supply, the human beings responsible for checking the system. The biology, once frozen correctly, is essentially inert, immune to time. It's the machinery keeping it cold that introduces risk, not the embryo itself. The embryo at the center of this story was frozen using the older slow freeze method, not vitrification, which became standard after roughly 2010. Slow frozen embryos from the 1990s have a lower survival rate on thawing than their vitrified counterparts. For a 1994 embryo to survive the thaw, transfer successfully, and produce a healthy baby 31 years later is, according to every fertility specialist who has commented on the case, exceptional. But the science of keeping embryos alive is only half the story. The other half is the question nobody was prepared to answer. What do you do with an embryo that's been waiting for 30 years, and the people who created it are gone?
Dr. Craig Sweet, who heads a fertility clinic in Florida, says frozen embryos can remain viable for a long time.
These embryos are really frozen solid, and so they're not aging, that they probably will live for centuries.
Sweet says 18% or 302 of his clinic's frozen embryos are abandoned, some for 20.
Right now, there are an estimated 1 million frozen embryos in storage across the United States. 1 million. Some belong to couples who completed their families and never came back. Some belong to people who died. Some belong to couples who divorced and whose embryos are now evidence in a custody dispute. Some belong to people who simply stopped paying the storage fees years ago, and the clinic doesn't know what to do with them. You don't hear about this very often, partly because fertility is a private subject, partly because the legal framework in the US has never resolved what exactly a frozen embryo is. In some states, it's property, divisible in a divorce like a bank account or a car. In others, it occupies a legally undefined middle ground, not a person, not an object, but something the law doesn't have a clean category for. The result is a system where the rules vary by state, clinics set their own policies, and millions of these tiny frozen specimens sit in bureaucratic limbo. The embryo that became the 2025 record holder was donated through a non-profit organization called the National Embryo Donation Center based in Knoxville, Tennessee. The NEDC was founded in 2003 specifically to address this problem. Their model works like this. A family with frozen embryos they don't intend to use can donate them. A receiving family undergoes a home study, the same process as conventional adoption, and is matched with a donated embryo. The parents in this case received the embryo in 2024. They were in their mid-20s. The embryo had been in frozen storage for nearly their entire lives. The mother, in accounts reported after the birth, described the experience of praying over the embryo before the transfer, holding in her mind that this small frozen thing had been waiting since before she could remember. The NEDC has facilitated over 1,000 births from donated embryos since it was founded. In every single one of those cases, someone made a decision about the future of a life that existed in frozen suspension before the receiving parents were even thinking about children. The biology allowed it. The infrastructure supported it. The ethics of it are still being worked out in real time. And here is where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable. Because the question isn't just how long can an embryo survive? The research has an answer to that. The question is, how long should they wait? Here is the thing most people assume about frozen embryos. The longer they've been frozen, the worse the outcome. It seems logical. Things degrade. Time damages things. The data says otherwise. A 2022 study published in the journal Human Reproduction analyzed outcomes from frozen embryo transfers across multiple storage durations. The result was clear: no statistically significant difference in live birth rates, birth weight, or neonatal complications between embryos frozen for under 5 years and embryos frozen for more than 10. A review from the European Society of Human Reproduction and Embryology reached the same conclusion. When cryopreservation is done correctly and storage infrastructure is maintained, duration of storage does not degrade embryo viability. Let that land for a second. An embryo frozen in 1994 using the older, less efficient slow freeze technique produces the same statistical outcomes as one frozen last year. The limiting variable isn't time. It's process quality and storage integrity. This has a practical implication that the fertility industry is only beginning to grapple with. There is no biological argument for imposing a storage time limit. If there were, you'd see declining outcomes past a certain point. You don't. The ceiling isn't biological. The ceiling, if there is one, is ethical. And ethical ceilings are set by people, not by biology. There are already embryos in storage that predate the World Wide Web. If current trends continue, embryos created in 2025 could theoretically result in births in 2060. The receiving parents would be implanting genetic material created by a couple who, by that point, might be elderly or deceased. The child born would be, in the most literal genetic sense, a contemporary of their grandparents. No country has a federal law that addresses this scenario. No international bioethics framework covers it. The science has already outrun the conversation. And here is why this matters to you right now in 2025. This isn't a niche issue for fertility specialists. There are 1 million embryos in American storage tanks today, and most of the people who created them have never thought about what happens next. Here is the optimistic version of this story, and I do think there is one. In 1984, the first frozen embryo birth was treated as a miracle. It happened once in Melbourne, and the medical world held its breath. By 1994, the year the embryo at the center of this video was created, frozen embryo transfers were becoming routine. By 2025, more than 10 million humans alive on Earth began their existence in a cryogenic storage tank. 10 million people. What the record set in July 2025 reveals is that the biology of human life is more resilient than anyone expected. An embryo, a cluster of cells smaller than the period at the end of this sentence, can survive 3 decades of suspended animation, be transferred into a woman who was a toddler when it was created, and produce a healthy child. The cells don't know how long they waited. They just resume. That's not a horror story. That's an astonishing fact about the durability of biological information. The instructions encoded in that embryo, the full blueprint for a human being, survived 30 years without a single error. In an era when we worry constantly about data degradation, hard drives failing, and cloud backups disappearing, the most reliable storage medium we have found is a glass vial at -196 degrees. The harder questions: who owns frozen life, how long it can wait, who gets to decide when the waiting ends, those are still open. They will be answered eventually not by biology, but by the societies we choose to build. The girl born in July 2025 doesn't know any of this yet. She's a baby. She has no record to defend, no policy to advocate for, no press conference to give. She's just here, after 30 years of waiting. If that made you look differently at something you thought you understood, that's what this channel is for. Subscribe and we'll keep finding the ones that break the model.